Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The storm had been raging for hours, but in the heart of New York City, no one paid much attention. Thunder rolled across the skyline like a distant war drum, and flashes of lightning danced between the towering buildings. The city had seen worse. It thrived on chaos, on the unpredictable. But when the lightning struck, a blinding white hot flash that tore through the sky, something changed. Times Square lit up brighter than it had ever been before, and the ground trembled as if the earth itself was gasping for air. And then he appeared. Amid the flickering lights and electric hum of the city, a boy stood alone. His clothes, torn and seamed at the edges, clung to his lean frame as if he had been dragged through a battle. His eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural light flickering within them, like the embers of a fire not yet extinguished. People stared frozen, unsure whether this was some elaborate street performance or a nightmare that had crawled out of the storm. Tony Bradford's son phone buzzed violently on the dashboard of his car, pulling him out of his half-asleep stupor. The notification flashed urgently. Incident in Times Square, priority level red. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he reached for his headset. "Hi, Clark, you awake?" Clark Daniels' voice came through the earpiece, low and steady, the way it always was. Kyle barely, "What's going on?" Priority red, Times Square. Tony said, starting the car. "Some kid gotta be serious if they waking us up for it." "Always is," Clark replied. "Meet you there." The streets were already a mess, but the second Tony's car screeched into Times Square, he knew this was different. Emergency vehicles had formed a perimeter, blue and red lights flashing in a wild pattern. People were being pushed back by the police, their cell phones raised high in the air to capture whatever madness was happening. In the middle of it all stood the boy. Tony stepped out of the car, his leather jacket pulled tight against the cold rain. He spotted Clark instantly, his tall frame and rigid posture unmistakable. The man looked like he belonged on the front lines of some forgotten war, not in the middle of a city investigation. That him, trotting toward the boy in the center of the square. The kid hadn't moved, his eyes still glowing faintly as he surveyed the crowd. "Yeah," Clark said, his voice low. "The reports are confusing. Some witnesses say he appeared out of nowhere. There was a flash, then he just stood there. No one's approached him yet." Tony squinted, trying to make sense of it. The kid looked young, no older than 16, but there was something off, something dangerous. "We'll take it from here," Tony said, motioning to the police to fall back. He and Clark approached cautiously, the rain soaking through their clothes. As they got closer, Tony could feel it, an energy radiating from the boy like static in the air, charging everything around them. "Hey," Tony called out, his voice firm but calm. "Right, what's your name, kid?" The boy didn't respond. At first, his eyes flicking from Tony to Clark and back again. He seemed disoriented, lost. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said, "Terry, Adrian." Clark stepped forward, his tone serious, but not unkind. "Adrian, we were here to help. Can you tell us what happened?" Adrian's gaze shifted to the ground, his hands curling into fists. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice filled with an odd mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tony exchanged a glance with Clark. The kid was clearly troubled, but there was something deeper at play. "All right, Adrian," he said carefully. "Carol, we're not here to hurt you. We just need to know what's going on. Can you tell us where you're from?" Adrian's eyes snapped back up, his voice suddenly sharper. "Well, you wouldn't believe me if I told you." Clark's expression remained unreadable, but Tony felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the boy's words, something in his tone that made it clear he wasn't bluffing. "Try us," Tony said. For a long moment, Adrian did saying, then almost reluctantly, he took a step toward them. The energy around him pulsed like a heartbeat that was growing stronger. "I am from the future," he said, his voice cold and flat, "and I am here to destroy your world." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Tony's mind raced, trying to process what he just heard. The future destroyed. Before he could finish, the ground beneath them shook violently. A crack of thunder roared overhead, and a surge of energy erupted from Adrian's body, sending a shockwave through the square. Tony and Clark were thrown backward, crashing into the pavement as debris scattered around them. "Shh," Tony muttered, trying to catch his breath. What the hell is this kid? Clark was already on his feet, his eyes locked on Adrian, who stood in the center of the chaos, his face twisted in pain and confusion. We need to move fast, Clark said, his voice tight. This kid isn't he just dangerous? He says a goddamn weapon. They managed to track Adrian later that night. After the chaos in Times Square, he disappeared, leaving the authorities scrambling to figure out what had just happened. But Tony wasn't one to sit around and wait for answers. He and Clark hit the ground running, scouring every security camera in the city until they found him. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Brooklyn, a place that had long been forgotten by the world. The windows were shattered and the walls were crumbling, but inside a faint glow illuminated the darkness. Tony and Clark entered the building cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the empty space. The air was thick with tension, and that same electric energy they had felt in Times Square seemed to hum all around them. Adrian was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the room, his eyes closed, his body glowing faintly. He looked peaceful, almost serene, but Tony knew better. This kid wasn't meditating, he was gathering power. Adrian, Clark called out, his voice echoing through the warehouse. Hi, we need to talk. The boy's eyes snapped open and the glow around him intensified. For a moment, Tony thought he might attack them again, but instead, Adrian stood slowly, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't be here, Adrian said, his voice low and threatening. As I told you, I have a mission to complete. Tony stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Forget it, kid. You think you're from the future, and you think you've got some big mission, but you need to understand something. Destroying the world isn't the answer. Adrian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Tony saw a flicker of doubt. You don't know what's coming, Adrian said quietly. You don't understand what the future holds. I've seen it. I've lived it. There's no saving this world. Clark's voice was calm, but firm. Maybe we don't know what the future holds, but we do know one thing: people can change. The future isn't set in stone. You have the power to make a different choice. Adrian stared at them, his expression hardening. It's too late for that. And with that, the air around them crackled, and Adrian's body began to glow brighter, the energy around him building to a dangerous level. Tony and Clark barely had time to react before the warehouse exploded in a blinding flash of light. When the dust settled, Adrian was gone. Back at headquarters, Tony and Clark sat in a dimly lit room watching the footage from the warehouse on repeat. They had barely escaped with their lives, and now the agency was on full alert. Adrian had gone from a troubled kid to a potential world ender, and the clock was ticking. He's not just dangerous, Tony said, rubbing his temples. He's unstable. If he goes through with this. Clark nodded, his face grim. We need to stop him before he makes another move. The door to the room opened, and Agent Smith, their superior, walked in, her expression serious. We've analyzed the data from the warehouse. Whatever Adrian is, he's not like anything we've seen before. His power is growing, and if he continues to gather energy. Tony finished her sentence, his voice heavy, trelly. He'll have enough to destroy the planet. Smith nodded. We need to take him down now. No more negotiation. Clark shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. Fear is to be another way. The kid's not a villain. He's scared, confused. We can reach him. Tony sighed, leaning back in his chair, and I don't know, Clark. After what we saw, I am not sure he's capable of making that choice. But deep down, Tony knew that Clark was right. There was something about Adrian, something that Zintura out. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a kid trying to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, a weight no one should have to bear. The question was, how much longer could they afford to wait before that weight crushed him and the rest of the planet with it? The rain was falling harder now, thick sheets of it pelting the city, turning the streets into rivers and the sidewalks into treacherous, slick pathways. Tony's phone buzzed again, another notification, another update on Adrian's whereabouts. This time the boy was heading toward the city's power grid, the largest energy source for miles around. It was the last place anyone would want someone like Adrian to be. Clark was already waiting by the car when Tony stepped out of the agency's building. His expression was grim, but his resolve was unshaken. as it always was. Tony could feel the tension in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement that things were moving faster than they could keep up with. "He's going to the grid," Tony said, slamming the car door shut and wiping the rain from his brow. "We're running out of time." Clark nodded, his jaw tight. "We need to get there before he does something irreversible." They sped through the city, sirens blaring, weaving through the late-night traffic. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the city itself sensed the danger lurking beneath the surface. Tony kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the image of Adrian standing there, eyes glowing, the weight of the world bearing down on his shoulder. What had driven a kid to this point? What kind of future could be so bad that the only solution was to wipe out the present? Clark, sitting beside him, was just as silent, but Tony knew his partner well enough to sense the conflict brewing inside him. Clark was always the one who saw the good in people, the one who believed that no one was beyond saving, but even he had to know they were running out of options. They arrived at the power grid minutes later, the towering structures looming over them like metallic giants. The air was thick with the hum of electricity, the faint crackle of energy coursing through the wires overhead. Tony and Clark stepped out of the car, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of Adrian. Then they saw him. Adrian was standing near the main generator, his body glowing with the same eerie light they'd seen before, but this time it was stronger, more intense. The energy around him pulsed and crackled like a storm waiting to be unleashed. He didn't seem to notice them at first, his focus entirely on the grid, on the power he was drawing into himself. "Adrian," Clark's voice cut through the rain, sharp and commanding. The boy said, head snapped up, his glowing eyes locking onto them. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, of hesitation, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a cold, determined expression. "You need to leave," Adrian said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to hurt you." Clark stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to fight you, Adrian. We were here to help, but you have to stop this. You don't need to do this." Adrian's expression hardened. "You don't understand. I've seen what happened. Future, it's worse than anything you can imagine. I have to stop it." Tony took a step forward, his voice calm but urgent. "You think wiping out the world is going to fix things? That's not the answer, kid. There's always another way." For a moment, Adrian seemed to waver, his gaze flicking between them, as if he was searching for something, some reassurance, some proof that they were right. But then the energy around him surged again, the glow intensifying, and Tony felt the air grow heavy with power. "I don't have a choice," Adrian said, his voice trembling. They made me do this. It sounds the only way." Clark's voice softened, a rare note of vulnerability creeping in. "You always have a choice, Adrian. No one can take that from you, not even them." The words seemed to hit something deep within the boy, and for a moment, Tony thought they might have reached him. The glow around Adrian dimmed slightly, the crackling energy around him stilling. But then, as if something snapped inside him, Adrian let out a cry of frustration, and the power surged again, stronger than before. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air around them crackled with electricity. Tony and Clark were thrown back as a shockwave erupted from Adrian's body, sending debris flying through the air. Tony hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, his vision blurring from the impact. He struggled to push himself up, his head ringing from the blast. Clark was already on his feet, his eyes locked on Adrian, who was now floating several feet above the ground, the energy around him swirling like a storm. The power grid was flickering wildly, the lights dimming and surging in erratic bursts as Adrian drew more and more energy into himself. "He's gonna blow the whole damn grid," Tony muttered, pushing himself to his feet. "We need to shut this down now." Clark nodded, his face set with grim determination. "I'll distract him. You get to the control." Tony didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the control room, weaving through the debris and dodging the arcs of electricity that crackled through the air. He could hear Clark shouting in the distance, trying to keep Adrian focused on him, trying to buy them time. The control room was a mess of wires and consoles, the lights flickering overhead as the system struggled to keep up with the power surge. Tony's sense flew over the controls, his mind racing, as he tried to figure out how to cut the power without causing an even bigger disaster. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of Clark and Adrian's voices, the crackle of energy, the roar of the storm. Tony knew they were running out of time. If Adrian managed to overload the grid, it wouldn't just be New York that suffered. The entire eastern seaboard could be plunged into darkness, and that was the least of their worry. His fingers found the emergency shutdown switch, and without a second thought, he pulled it. The lights in the control room went out instantly, and Tony felt a moment of cold, terrifying silence. Then the roar of energy outside died down, the crackling electricity fading into nothingness. Tony stumbled out of the control room, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with smoke, the ground still trembling slightly from the residual energy. Clark was standing a few feet away, his body bruised and battered but alive. And Adrian was on his knees, his body trembling, the glow around him flickering weakly. The boy looked up at them, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, the weight of what he had almost done written all over his face. "I couldn't stop it," Adrian whispered, his voice breaking. "I tried, but I couldn't stop it." Clark knelt down beside him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "It's not over now," he said softly. "You don't have to carry this alone." Tony approached slowly, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of residual danger. But it was clear the worst had passed. The grid was offline, the city was safe, and Adrian, for the first time since they had met him, seemed human. But Tony knew better than to think this was the end. Back at headquarters, they sat in silence, watching the footage from the power grid over and over. Adrian was being kept in a secure facility, monitored day and night, his powers suppressed by technology, far beyond what Tony had ever seen. The world had come closer to destruction than anyone would ever know, and the people of New York would wake up the next morning with no idea how close they had come to oblivion. But for Tony and Clark, the weight of it all still lingered. Adrian had been a kid thrown into an impossible situation, forced to carry the future of the world on his shoulder. And while they had stopped him from completing his mission, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. That somewhere in some far-off future, Adrian's story was far from over. Clark broke the silence first, his voice low and thoughtful. "You think we will ever know the full story? What really happened in his future?" Tony shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know, but I do know one thing: we were not done with him yet." The rain had finally stopped outside, the city quiet once more. But in the stillness, Tony could help but feel that the storm was far from over.